welcome. We are going to get on with Science of Logic. We're starting with infinity, but since we've traversed quite a bit, last time we did a bit of review, but let's do a bit of review again. That always helps. So, we're all familiar of being nothing becoming, so let's just review existence. Existence is quite easily literally just the distinction of well, that is weird. No. Huh. No. That's a bit annoying. Let's see. All right, it's not playing. It's not playing properly with me. Nope. Well, anyways, left side being right side nothing. Let's go with that real quick. So existence is just that unity of being a nothing. From that, we then have determinate being, which we can take as being which has non-being, or rather, that's a bit too messy. Being which has non-being as part of it, being which is by virtue of not being. That then leads us to reality, which actually let's change the color a bit here. Reality, one could take that white space, and negation, which is that insofar as reality is, it is distinguished, it is not the negation. Likewise, insofar as the negation is, it is not the reality, so reality is both in its own inversion, a negation. Negation is likewise a reality, insofar as it is opposed to, reality. As we remembered, so reality is determinate being, or determinateness. So, one can kind of visualize like that, being with a non-being in it. That is reality, insofar as it is. It's faced by an opposition, a negation right by it, because to be is to exist. Obviously, then this creates this distinction. This distinction itself is the distinction of negation. So, remember that negation is the non-being of that unity. Then reality and negation come together as something. And what I'm trying to do here is I have an image in my mind, and I've done this before. It's just like getting to it is kind of a bit tricky. So let's see how you play this out. So we have something which is real, is also negative. It is real insofar it is the affirmation of the immediacy of being. It is negative insofar as clearly it is not the other. Maybe that doesn't help too much. Probably go back to the circles. We have something, reality, negation. Something is, of course, that unity, this whole unity of reality, negation. You can also see the other as arising as the distinction or the non-being of that unity. So you can see as the something and other are just kind of inverse faces of the exact same thing. Insofar as something, but then so you can see them as inverse. Something is the unity of that. The unity would be that dialectical circuit that happens. The other is precisely then the distinction of that circuit. Various ways you can get to that. You could also get it through, insofar as that is going on. Insofar as something is, it exists. As far as it exists, it has a non-being beside it. This non-being is the other. And that's how you produce the other. Another way to also see that is you have something, insofar as something is, it exists. But instead of immediately saying, oh, there's a non-being beside it, you can go and say, well, something is. It opposes itself as something, but that opposition itself is a non-being distinction. It also gets you otherness. Makes sense so far? Might not be so neat and clean as I want to make it. Yes, no? Alright.
Yeah, I think so.
Right, then from something and other, we have their mutual otherness, which is being for other. And insofar as things are being for other, the logical consequence is you need something to be at all in order for there to be a distinction in which they can be for other. You cannot be for other without having, therefore, a being in itself, as Hegel calls it. Likewise, you can have something in itself which is not being distinguished from another, and therefore the in itself is also by virtue of not being for other. Then we have the being in itself and being for other, which insofar as these form a unity, about like this, that is what determination is. The determination is determinate being in itself. And all of this is within the something. And then likewise, the same thing happens where insofar as this is a unity, this unity also has clearly a moment of distinction. This moment of distinction is what is called constitution. And again, you can have the, simply by taking that totality of determination is, it exists, therefore it has an other besides it, but if it has another besides it, the internal meaning of determination is a negative distinction, which is precisely what is constitution. Here being in itself and being for other constitute each other, and that is their determination. And that's how we get the flipping back and forth between constitution and determination. Insofar as we have these relationships of negative self-relationships. If constitution is constituted and it is within itself, but that which is in a something, which is in the being itself, is precisely what determination is. Therefore, constitution is determination. But if determination is, then it's distinguished, because to be is to exist, it's to have a difference, and yada, yada, yada. And that's how you get that circle. Then likewise, we have determination, and we have constitution, and then these form the limit. And limit is at once both a negative and a positive determination or determinacy, one would say. Where insofar as, here's where this idea comes in. Insofar as something is, it is distinguished from itself, it exists, it has its limit. Its limit, however, is within it. So let me something there's something as a totality, then there's the limit. The limit is not outside, but is inside the something, but it also is the bounding of the something. So the something here, the universal something, is split into particular somethings through its limit. That insofar as the something has the other, the limit also being the other of the something, the something is within the limit. Or here, again, this might be a better visualization. This is the limit. This is something. This is something. So something is within the limit, but at the same time, one can say that something is outside the limit, and both of these make perfectly good sense. But were you to remove this limit, we would have nothing. The determination falls away, and we return back to just the indeterminacy, or rather the very immediate determinacy of just mere existence, in which being and nothing are in a simple unity. So insofar as something is co-limiting, something limits the limit, but then the limit itself is something. Because if it is the other is also the other of the other, and therefore a something. And so that which is limited limits, and that which limits is limited. But that unity of something and limit is precisely what the finite is. The finite is the immediate unity of something with limit. Insofar as the finite immediately is, it is restriction. And take the circle's line as its limit and its internality as the something. But again, if infinite restriction is, then it exists. If it exists, it clearly has an other, and obviously a restriction is restricted, or rather here, this is all you need. If this is restriction, it is restricted by that which it's not. What is it that the restriction is not? It is not the ought. The ought is restricting restriction. It is the limitation upon the something. But of course, insofar as the ought limits restriction, restriction likewise limits the ought, because the ought is not absolute. The ought is only the ought. It ought to be, but it isn't. So insofar as the ought to be, it is restricted. Insofar as the restriction is restriction, or is restricted, it isn't what it ought to be, and therefore we have this, a mutual distinction. Restriction, and all this, the white area is the ought. Insofar as this is not this is not that, they are mutually not each other. That is what the finite essentially is. And so we have here now the dynamic of restriction and the ought. And we are moving here towards the total. Well, we have already moved into the totality of the infinite. So that's what the transition is heading towards. DM asks, should we think about limitation as what determines determinacy? Yes, you can do that. Yes, limitation is a determinate determinacy. And if you want to put it in this way, recall back, determinacy is, the unity, or rather the being with non-being within it. That does work. I have this idea. So being with non-being. Then this is reality, and this is negation. So reality is immediate determinacy. So that this little thing is just determinacy as such, or at least in the accent of being. And then likewise, this is it in its accent of nothing. But of course, pay attention to the structure. The structure has been repeated. And the unity of reality and negation is obviously, we already know that that's something. And it's other. So the something and other are the first determinateness. And then insofar as we keep recurring that structure, we are at something like about 3 levels of determinateness determining itself. So limit is a determinate determinateness, but it's a really determinate determinateness. Let's see if I can do this. So there's existence, it's reality, negation, this is something, and other, and then this is being in itself and being for other, and this is determination and constitution. So what is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We're at 5 levels of determinacy here. Make sense? Did I answer your question satisfactorily, DM? Hello, hello, can people hear me?
Yeah.
All right, well, let's get going back on the text. Now, I think last time we asked even we didn't finish the transition, but it's really short, so it's perfectly fine. So, yeah, we have developed here from restriction and the ought, and we've had that circuit ongoing. So, gamma, transition of the finite into the infinite. The ought contains restriction explicitly for itself, and restriction contains the ought. Their mutual connection is the finite itself, which contains them both in itself. These moments of its determination are qualitatively opposed. Restriction is determined as the negative of the ought, and the ought equally as the negative of restriction. The finite is thus in itself the contradiction of itself. It sublates itself, it goes away and ceases to be. But this, its result, the negative as such, is alpha, its very determination, for it is the negative of the negative. And I mean, just notice that the self-reference of the negative here, like people ask, what is the negation of negation? All this stuff happening here is negations of negations. The ought is the negative of restriction. Restriction is the negative of the ought. The finite is a self-contradiction of itself. It sublates itself. It goes away and ceases to be. With this, its result, negative as such, is its very determination, for it is the negative of the negative. So in going away and ceasing to be, the finite has not ceased. It has only become momentarily an other finite, which equally is, however, a going away as a going over into another finite, and so forth to infinity. But beta, if we consider this result more closely in its going away and ceasing to be, in this negation of itself, the finite has attained its being in itself. In it, it has rejoined itself. Each of its moments contains precisely this result. The ought transcends the restriction, that is, it transcends itself, but its beyond, as its other, is only restriction itself. Restriction, for its part, immediately points beyond itself to its other, and this is the ought, but this ought is the same direction of its in-itselfness and determinateness as is restriction. It is the same thing. In going beyond itself, restriction thus equally rejoins itself. This identity with itself, the negation of negation, is affirmative being. Is thus the other the finite, which is supposed to have the first negative for its determinateness. This other is the infinite. So let me see if I can draw this. So we have the restriction. The restriction is restricted. As restriction, it passes over into its misspelling. It's into the ought. Why? Because restriction refers to itself as restriction in the immediacy of the ought. But if restriction is restriction, then it is what it ought to be as restriction, and it is now in itself. Likewise, the ought, which is the determination, as Hegel says, is that which is the inner content. The ought for itself has the distinction of the restriction within it, insofar as the ought to be, it is restricted, because to be is to exist, and therefore we have the back and forth. So we have the restriction, the finite restriction, which transcends into the finite ought, but the ought returns right back to the restriction. So we have this process of the finite, which we normally conceive as, again, restriction. The finite dissolves itself, passes over into the ought, which is the infinite beyond. The ought for itself, though, is that distinction of the restriction, which makes it itself restricted. So we go from a restriction to a restriction, back again to another ought, back again to another restriction. And infinitely. And then this process, this total process of the infinite chain of finites, is the first concept of the infinite which we have. And here, we have the self-reference of the finite, in which the finite ceases to be because it is finite, but because it ceases to be, it then reposits itself in its ought as yet another finite. And so that it rejoins itself in its own failure and success of being itself. What page are we on? We are on page 108 of the PDF. Well, at least 108 in my PDF reader, 181 on the PDF itself. Yeah, and page 108 of the book itself. So anyways, we'll go into more detail here with the infinity as such. So see infinity. The infinite in its simple concept can be regarded first of all as a fresh definition of the absolute. And a reminder again, at every single point in the logic, we must treat whatever concept we're dealing with as the absolute concept. We cannot make it or treat it as relative to anything else. This is the only way we get these self-references to come out. Otherwise, we get lost in all these external considerations of things that we're relating, which may be related in further developments, but which are not clearly related at whatever point we are at. So, people want to talk about things about like consciousness here or whatever. It just muddles everything. You want to talk about stuff like essence, it still just muddles everything. It's methodologically necessary, and it just simply is practically a good thing to do, which is just to keep yourself at that absolute level, just straitjacket your mind into thinking only that concept which we have before us. So the infinite simple concept can be regarded first of all as a fresh definition of the absolute, as self-reference devoid of determination. It is posited as being and becoming. So the self-reference is a self-reference of what? Finite to the finite to itself as restriction of restriction, and the ought of the ought. And it is being and becoming. Why is it being? It is being because the infinite as such is just the immediacy. It's not yet, it says void of determination, or devoid of determination. Also, devoid of determinacy insofar as it just is, it's not yet determinate. Becoming in that it's this cycle already of the positing of one finite after another. So it's the being of that movement, of that shift from restriction to the ought to restriction. Just like how becoming was the shift of being to nothing and nothing to being. So if you've been here for all the sessions or listened to all the readings, this should be very clear, I think. The forms of existence have no place in the series of determinations that can be regarded as definitions of the absolute, since the forms of that sphere are immediately posited for themselves only as determinacies, as finite in general. So note there, to be determinate is to be finite. The forms of existence have no place in the series of determinations that can be regarded as definitions of the absolute. So anything that's absolute is itself not going to be determinate as its level of absoluteness. If becoming turns out to be the absolute, for example, well, we know it doesn't, but if it did turn out to be absolute, there would be nothing else to be determined about becoming. There would be no coming to be or ceasing to be, which would put it in relationship to another nor to itself at a finite level. That wouldn't happen. So here we're seeing that there are some clues appearing as to what would the absolute actually look like if we found it. How would we know that we've achieved whatever it is that we're searching to achieve in this investigation? The assumption is we have the absolute. We're getting to the absolute. How would we know? If we haven't gotten to it, if we haven't experienced it, if we haven't seen it, and if we don't already possess it consciously, how do we know if we acquired it? One of the things is it certainly would not have the determinations of the finite. But the infinite is accepted unqualifiedly as absolute, since it is explicitly determined as the negation of the finite, the restrictedness to which a being and becoming would somehow be susceptible even if they do not have it or exhibit it, is thereby both explicitly referred to and denied in it. So the infinite is the restrictions of finite, the restrictedness is thereby both explicitly referred to and denied in it. So this first concept of finite, it refers itself negatively against the finite. So this should ring some alarms for you, because these relationships are relationships of existence. They're relationships of finitude. So this first finite that we're thinking of can't really be, the first version of the infinite we're thinking of cannot really be the true absolute, or if we have a certain intent for the word to mean something very close to the absolute, then this first form of the infinite cannot be the true infinite. But in fact, by just this negation, the infinite is not already free from restrictedness and finitude. It is essential to distinguish the true concept of infinity from bad infinity, the infinite of reason from the infinite of the understanding. The latter is in fact a finitized infinite, and as we shall now discover, in wanting to maintain the infinite pure and distant from the finite, the infinite is by that very fact only made finite. The infinite is A, in simple determination, is the affirmative as negation of the finite. B, but is thereby an alternating determination with the infinite, and is abstract, one-sided infinite. C, is the self-sublation of this infinite and of the finite in one process. This is the true infinite. A, the infinite in general. The infinite is the negation of the negation, the affirmative, being that has reinstated itself out of restrictedness. The infinite is, in a more intense sense than the first immediate being, it is the true being, the elevation above restriction. At the mention of the infinite, soul and spirit light up, for in the infinite the spirit is at home, and not only abstractly, rather it rises to itself, to the light of its thinking, its universality, its freedom. I like that. Lines, quite poetic. What is first given with the concept of the infinite is this: that in its being in itself, existence is determined as finite and transcends restriction. That is, it is the very nature of the finite that it transcends itself, that it negate its negation and become infinite. Consequently, the infinite does not stand above the finite as something ready-made by itself, as if the finite stood fixed outside or below it. Nor is it we only, as a subjective reason, who transcend the finite into the infinite, as if in saying that the infinite is a concept of reason, and that through reason we elevate ourselves above things temporal, we did this without prejudice to the finite, without this elevation, which remains external to the finite, affecting it. Insofar as the finite itself is being elevated to infinity, it is not at all an alien force that does this for it. It is rather its nature to refer itself to itself as restriction, both restriction as such and as ought, and to transcend this restriction, or rather in this self-reference to have negated the restriction and gone above and beyond. It is not in the sublation of the finite in general that infinity in general comes to be, but the finite is rather just this, that through its nature it comes to be itself the infinite. Infinity is its affirmative determination, its vocation, what it truly is in itself. The finite has thus vanished into the infinite, and what is only the infinite. Alright, so just a quick recap. So the finite is immediately the restricted. The restricted, insofar as it is, right, against it exists, refers to itself as restricted. In doing so, right, so restriction is restricted. Restriction is restricted. Self-reference. Insofar as it refers to itself, it overcomes itself. How? Again, because of this. This, or rather, should work here for once. Okay. The black space is that traversal self-reference. Clearly this is just a metaphor in this case. But ontologically, or in the sense of, or rather, in pure sense as meaning, this gap that arises between this restriction and itself, in order for it to refer to itself, or rather, insofar that it must oppose itself. It must exist. That in order for finitude to be, it must exist, therefore it must relate itself to nothing, therefore it must finitize itself in this relationship. But that finitization provides, the black space here, the division, which both unites and divides it. Insofar as it divides it, it finitizes it, restricts it, as these two moments. But insofar as these two moments are allowed in cognition to be, which causes them to exist, which causes us to posit the next finite, which then gives us this total relationship, in which the finite is separated and united with itself. That total relationship is what the infinite is. The infinite is the space, let's call it that. It's a logical space in which the finite as finite can even appear. So the finite indeed is finite. But it is more than finite, because if it wasn't more than finite, it wouldn't even be finite. Because it wouldn't even appear. We wouldn't have restriction if that was the case. We would be right back at being and nothing, because with no restrictions, there are no limits, no constitutions or determinacies, no being for other, no being in itself, no something, no other, no reality, no negation, no being which is distinguished from non-being. We are right back to the indeterminacy of the very beginning of the logic. So does that make sense so far? I mean, that's one way to understand that, besides just like the clearly linguistic sense that is obviously the prime sense of the text. All right. B. Alternating determination of finite and infinite. The infinite is, in this immediacy, it is at the same time the negation of an other, of the finite, and so as existent and at the same time as the non-being of an other, it has fallen back into the category of something determinate in general. More precisely, the infinite is the existence reflected into itself, which results from the mediating sublation of determinateness in general, and is consequently posited as existence distinct from its determinateness. Therefore, it has fallen back into the category of something with a limit. In accordance with this determinateness, the finite stands over against the infinite as real existence. They thus remain outside each other, standing in qualitative mutual reference. The immediate being of the infinite resurrects the being of its negation, of the finite again, which seemed at first to have vanished into the infinite. So, okay, here you can see the recursion of the logic. This whole paragraph is nothing but that. The infinite is, in this immediacy, it is at the same time the negation of another, of the finite. Insofar as it is, it exists. Insofar as it exists, it's the unity of being or non-being. Insofar as being and non-being are, they are mutual negations of each other. Being is not nothing. Nothing is not being. And insofar as being, it is not nothing. Insofar as nothing, it is not being. And insofar as each is both at the same time a reality and negation, each is a something, each is an other, and therefore we have the entire recursion of the logic all over again. From existence all the way back to the infinite, and so as existing at the same time as the non-being of another has fallen back into the category of something determinate in general, and once again the whole logic recurs, and this is what happens every time we make a new step. At every new step, this step is boom, the entire everything we've done up to then recurs. And it's kind of funny that, and we can do that explicitly and, show that, but usually it's pretty quickly that you can make an immediate cognition of that as well. But the infinite and the finite are not in these referential categories only. The two sides are further determined in addition to being as mere others to each other. Namely, the finite is restriction posited as restriction. It is existence posited with the determination that it passes over into what it is, it's in itself, and becomes infinite. Infinity is the nothing of the finite, the in itself that the latter ought to be, but it is at the same time as reflected within itself as realized ought as only affirmative, self-referring being. In infinity we have the satisfaction that all determinateness, alteration, all restriction, and the ought itself together with it have vanished or sublated, and the nothing of the finite is posited. As this negation of the finite is the being in itself determined, which, as negation of negation, is in itself affirmative, yet this affirmation is qualitatively immediate self-reference, being, and because of this the affirmative is led back to the category of being that has the finite confronting it as an other. It is negative nature. Its negative nature is posited as existent negation, and hence as first and immediate negation. The infinite is in this way burdened with the opposition to the finite, and this finite as an other remains a real existence, even though in its being in itself, in the infinite, it is at the same time posited as sublated. This infinite is that which is not finite, a being in the determinateness of negation. Contrasted with the finite, with the series of existent determinacies of realities, the infinite is an determinate emptiness, the being of the beyond of the finite, whose being itself is not in its existence, which is something determinate. As thus posited over against the finite, the two are connected by the qualitative mutual reference of others. The infinite is is to be called the bad infinite, the infinite of the understanding, for which it counts as the highest, the absolute truth. The understanding believes that it has attained satisfaction in the reconciliation of truth, while it is in fact entangled in unreconciled, unresolved, absolute contradictions. And it is these contradictions in which it falls on every side whenever it embarks on the application and explication of these categories that belong to it, that must make it conscious of the fact. This contradiction is present in the very fact that the infinite remains over against the finite, with the result that there are two determinacies. There are two worlds, one infinite and one finite, and in their connection the infinite is only the limit of the finite, and thus only a determinate itself, finite, infinite. So, yeah, again. So, let this line be the finite itself as restriction. And this white space within is the infinite as determination, or the ought. And if you remember the structure of the ought is the self-referential determination. Is the being which self-references rather than references another. But we already know, right, that the ought, because it is, and Hegel's already told us, insofar as it references itself, it is immediate being, but if it's immediate being, it has the whole process of logic recur upon itself. That which is, exists, it's an opposition, and therefore, the beyond is not a free beyond, it's still related to the finite. The inner is related to the outer necessarily. The infinite here is a negative reference of the finite. So, if this is the finite, all of this otherwise is the infinite, but because the infinite is not that little dot, God, damn it, because it's not that, it is related, it is limited. This little dot, this finite, is a non-being within the infinite being. And insofar as the infinite being must say, I am not that non-being, to that extent it is a non-being. So the infinite is finitized along with the finite. And that's why it's not a true infinite, because the infinite is supposed to be that which is boundless. But here clearly the boundless is bounded. Do you have a question, DM? Because if you have questions, please ask. You're likely going to help other people who are confused in the same way.
Well, I was wondering, do you think in a way it may be good to understand infinity as a chain of causation? So like rather than eternity where just you have a thing that's endless, right? When I think of infinity, I think of these series of causes that just don't stop. I don't know if that is a helpful way to think about this though.
No, it's not, because that's exactly what Hegel's saying is wrong with this, that this is an infinite chain of just a repositing of one thing after another, whether you put it in a frame of causes or ontological relationships like grounds. All of these are finite modes of understanding. They're not getting to what it must mean to be infinite, not finite. The not finite, if it is opposed to the finite, is not finite. The boundless here is not a numerical boundlessness, not quantitative. It's categorical boundlessness. So on the very specification of meaning, it cannot even be bounded by a differential meaning, because then it's finitized.
So that in this way, how could we distinguish this from eternity? Because I always understood eternity to be this more, this broader boundlessness.
Well, this is a purely logical concept, whereas eternity is still it is a logical concept in the philosophy of nature. But if you see parallels between this and eternity, you're right, because eternity is an existential mode of infinitude. Eternity is particularly time itself, which transcends the temporality of time. Time itself is not temporal. The time itself is not a moment in time, but is the totality of time. So time is that process of past, future, present, and the present is not some kind of like finite present, but it's the absolute present, which is what eternity is. So eternity is the present which is present in all of time. It's the unity of all moments of time. Likewise, the infinite here is the unity of all finitude with itself.
That's interesting. Let me make a note of that.
Okay, here's an image, right? So we already have the finite, which is restriction, just keeps, posits the ought, but the ought, because of it ought, is another restriction, which posits another restriction endlessly. This process is the infinity we have right now. So, it's this movement of restriction, ought, restriction, which reposits the finite, again, its own dissolution. This is the infinity we have. This chain, if you put it as a chain of causes, this is cause, effect, but this effect itself causes other things, so more effects, and then because this itself is also finite, it has priors, and then that has a prior. The finite has no moment where it can stop. It goes forward and backwards infinitely. The cause form is just another finite form. And then this, obviously, if we oppose the finite again to the infinite, this itself puts in a structure, of course, of a limitation. It is not. Finite isn't infinite, the infinite isn't finite, but then that itself, of course, is the structure of finitude. So we are repositing it over again. So this relationship of a mutual non-being on the same level cannot be the relationship of the finite to the infinite. What Hegel's saying here is the finite and the infinite cannot actually be related on the same level. It's not a relationship like being and nothing within becoming. The infinite is the relationship of the finite to the finite. There is no relationship of the finite to the infinite, because that would be a finite relationship.
Do you think we could say that they're not a true dichotomy?
Yeah, I would say here, like, you would call a category mistake. That it makes sense why we think it's a dichotomy, and the way we place it is a dichotomy, but the dichotomy is not proper to what we intend. Because, at least philosophically, it seems, the concept of the qualitative infinite, the categorical infinite, was the predominant meaning of the infinite up until the revolution of mathematics in the 1800s.
Yeah. It's not a true dichotomy because they're not true opposites, but we juxtapose them for our ability to try and understand things.
Yeah, that would be true.
When you're talking about the revolution of mathematics, so you're not referring to Cantor at all, because that was in the 1900s, and I know he had a lot to do with like the diagonalization proof with regard to infinity. I was wondering if that discussion is at all involved in this discussion of infinity.
Yeah, there was a revolution in the concept of infinity, even in the 1800s, and it's just like the ways in which like people started doing have different notions of infinity. Like the mathematical notion of infinity started to diverge from the philosophical notion, like around the 1800s, and it's not until the 1900s where a lot of the new axiomatizations and new systems at least provided a more clear axiomatic conception of that. But even in the 1800s, there were nebulous new conceptions that were being worked with.
See, but it's just the formalization of that. Well, this different account that isn't really related to what we're talking about right now, because it's still like defining the infinite by finite, and by that definition, by that relation, it's still finite in some way. Like, so then it wouldn't really make sense to. It's not the categorical infinite that we're talking about, not the qualitative infinite.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Let's continue. This contradiction is present in the very fact that the infinite remains over against the finite, with the result that there are two determinacies. There are two worlds, one infinite and one finite, and in their connection, the infinite is only the limit of the finite, and thus only determinate itself finite, infinite. This contradiction develops its content into more explicit forms. The finite is the real existence, which persists as such, even when it has gone over into its non-being, the infinite. As we have seen, this infinite has for its determinateness over against the finite only the first immediate negation, just as the finite as negated has over against this negation only the meaning of an other, and is therefore still a something. When therefore the understanding, elevating itself above this finite world, rises to what is the highest for it, to the infinite, the finite world remains for it as something on this side here, and thus posited only above the finite. The infinite is separated from the finite, and for the same reason, the finite from the infinite. Each is placed in a different location, the finite as existence here, and the infinite, although the being itself of the finite, there as a beyond, at a nebulous, inaccessible distance outside, which there stands enduring the finite. And if you're familiar with metaphysical, particularly theological debates, even up to the present, this distinction is almost at the core of everything. Almost every problem with the conceptions of God have to do with this distinction. Problems about the nature of the one and the many have to do with this distinction. And as a matter of fact, this will be a consequence of what the infinite really is in chapter 3. So this concept, this whole chapter has all these concepts are really things that if you look at just general philosophy, it's everywhere. As thus separated, they are just as much essentially connected with each other, and through the very negation that divides them. This is always something to remember in you see it. Through the very negation that divides them. It's negative unity. insofar as we have something and other, as it's been pointed out, this very negative distinction between them is precisely what unites them. Insofar as the other is the other, it is something. But it refers to itself, goes back to itself as a positive being. This then is its own totality. And that looks like a mess, but you get the point. Negations, non-beings, are essential to being. Like, they cannot be gotten rid of. They are the very way in which things can be. It's the very condition of possibility, if you want to put it in those terms. Without distinction, without differences, without negations, there simply is no being in any meaningful sense. We arrive back at, indeterminacies. So these very distinctions are the very things which unify. Another way to put it is, you cannot have opposition without a ground of position. In order to oppose, there must be a positing and a ground on which they can be distinguished. If you're talking with somebody, says, like, I'm on the opposite side of where? Opposite in, if you're on the opposite side of the road, you have to have a road first to be opposed to opposite sides. If you're on the opposite side of the planet, you still need to have the planet in order to have the notion of the opposite side. The opposites do not make sense, cannot be made intelligible, cannot even exist if there is no negative division in which also things inhere as distinguished, united in that division. Opposition is relative. Opposition is a relative. It's like the other of the other, right? The other of the other. Well, the other is a relative concept. Why? Because it immediately refers itself to an other. Opposition is a relative concept. It immediately refers itself to an opposite of itself. Yeah, it is a relative concept. It's relational. Absolutely relative concept, I would say. This negation connecting them, these things reflected into themselves, is the common limit of each over against the other, and that too in such a way that each does not merely have this limit in it over against the other, but the negation is rather the in itselfness of each. Each thus has for itself, in its separation from the other, the limit in it, but the limit is the first negation. Both are thus limited, finite in themselves, yet as each affirmatively refers itself to itself, each is also the negation of its limit. Each thus immediately repels the negation from itself as its non-being and qualitatively severed from it, posits it as an other being outside it. The finite posits its non-being as this infinite, and the infinite likewise the finite. It is readily conceded that the finite passes over into the infinite necessarily, that is, through its determination, and is thereby elevated to what is its in itself. For while the finite is indeed determined as subsistent existence, it is at the same time also a null in itself, and therefore destined to self-dissolution, whereas the infinite, although burdened with negation and limit, is equally also determined as the existent in itself, so that this abstraction of self-referring affirmation is what constitutes its determination, and hence finite existence is not present in it. But it has been shown that the infinite itself attains affirmative being only by the mediation of negation, as negation of negation, and that when its formation thus obtained is taken as just simple qualitative being, the negation contained in it is demoted to simple immediate negation, and therefore to determinateness and limit, and these then are excluded from the infinite as contradicting its in itself. They are posited as not belonging to it, but rather as opposed to its in itself as the finite, since each is in it, and through its determination, the positing of its other, the two are inseparable. But this unity rests hidden in their qualitative otherness. It is their inner unity, one that lies only at their base. The manner of the appearance of this unity has thereby been defined. The unity is posited in existence as a turning over or transition of the finite into the infinite, and vice versa, so that the infinite only emerges in the finite in the infinite, the other in the other, that is to say, each arises in the other independently and immediately, and the connection is only an external one. Okay, I'm trying to picture this in my head. I get the words, but I'm trying to see if I can make an image of this. Let's reread this more slowly. So beginning with where it says, so this negation connecting them, these somethings reflected into themselves, is the common limit of each other over against the other. Okay, let's see. Good enough. So yeah, these are the somethings, finite, infinite. So is the common limit of each other. Okay, this negation connecting them, these somethings reflected into themselves, is the common limit of each other over against the other. And that too in such a way that each does not merely have its limit in it over against the other, but the negation is rather the in itselfness of each. Each thus has for itself, in its separation from the other, the limit in it. But the limit is the first negation. Both are thus limited, finite in themselves. Yet as each affirmatively refers itself to itself, each is also the negation of its limit. Each thus immediately repels the negation from itself as its non-being, and qualitatively severed from it, posits it as an other being outside it. The finite posits its non-being as this infinite, in the infinite likewise the finite. It is readily conceded that the finite passes over into the infinite necessarily, that is, through its determination, and is thereby elevated to what it is in itself. While the finite is indeed determined as subsistent existence, it is at the same time also a null in itself, and therefore it is destined to self-dissolution, whereas the infinite, although burdened with negation and limit, is equally also determined as the existent in itself, so that this abstraction of self-referring affirmation is what constitutes its determination, and hence finite existence is not present in it. So, right. So the infinite, or rather the finite, states it is not the infinite. Likewise, the infinite states it is not the finite. But the finite refers it to itself as limited, and that's why it's not the infinite. And the infinite rejects the finite precisely as the rejection of limits categorically. So the finite is not the infinite because it is limited. The infinite, however, is not the finite because it is not limited. So for the finite, the limit, this bounding, is internal to it. Whereas for the infinite, the bounding is not. The limit is outside it. But because the finite is limited, it says, for a while the finite is indeed determined as subsistent existence, it is at the same time also a null in itself and therefore destined to self-dissolution. So, the finite asserts its own limitedness and therefore dissolves itself because of it. Its restriction is restricted, its oughtness is also restricted as an ought. Whereas the infinite, although burdened with negation and limit, is equally also determined as the existent in itself. So that this abstraction of self-referring affirmation is what constitutes its determination. Hence, finite existence is not present in it. But it has been shown that the infinite itself attains affirmative being only by the mediation of negation, as negation of negation, and that when its affirmation is thus attained, taken as just simple qualitative being, the negation contained in it is demoted to simple immediate negation, and therefore to determinateness and limit, and these then are excluded from the infinite as contradicting its in itself. They are posited as not belonging to it, but rather as opposed to its in itself as the finite. Since each is in it through its determination, the positing of its other, the two are inseparable, but this unity rests hidden in their qualitative otherness. It is their inner unity, one that lies only at their base. And their base would be, this unifying negative space, the negative unity. The manner of the appearance of this unity has thereby been defined. The unity is posited in existence as a turning over or transition of the finite into the infinite and vice versa, so that the infinite only emerges in the finite and the finite in the infinite, the other in the other. That is to say, each arises in the other independently and immediately, and their connection is only an external one. The process of their transition has the following detailed shape. We have the finite passing over into the infinite. This passing over appears as an external doing. In this emptiness beyond the finite, what arises? What is there of positive in it? On account of the inseparability of the infinite in the finite, or because this infinite which stands apart is itself restricted, the limit arises. The infinite has vanished in the other, the finite has stepped in. But the stepping in of the finite appears as an event external to the infinite, and the new limit as something that does not arise out of the infinite itself, but is likewise found given. And with this we are back at the previous determination, which has been sublated in vain. This new limit, however, is itself only something to be sublated or transcended, and so there arises again the emptiness, the nothing, in which we find again the said determination, and so forth to infinity.
terms in philosophy, right? You're gonna be able to move through the thoughts when going through this material a lot more fluidly.
Yeah.
All right, back.
And
Your internet connection negated itself, Antonio.
The cats negated it.
They're frisky beings.
Yeah, they are. Anyways, where did I disconnect? What was I saying? Anyways, the process of transition has the following detailed shape. We have the finite passing over into the infinite. This passing over appears as an external doing. In this emptiness beyond the finite, what arises? What is there positive in it on account of the inseparability of the infinite and the finite? Or because this infinite which stands apart is itself restricted, the limit arises. The infinite has vanished in the other, the finite has stepped in. But the stepping in of the finite appears as an event external to the infinite, and the new limit has something that does not arise out of the infinite itself, but is likewise found given. And with this we are back at the previous determination, which has been sublated in vain. Okay, so this whole paragraph is just about like the way this might appear to us, or in fact how it probably does appear to us when we don't think about this conceptually, in that, people say, well, no, it's not the finite that passes over, but it's, our consciousness which passes over the finite and, into the infinite. In this emptiness beyond the finite, what arises? What is there positive in it on account of the inseparability, the infinite and the finite? The limit arises. The infinite has vanished, and the other, the finite, has stepped in. So, right, we go from the finite dot to the infinite, or do I still have this up? Yeah. So it's our consciousness that goes from the finite to the infinite, and our consciousness notices that there's obviously this relationship to the finite, which then finitizes the infinite, and we're right back to the finite again. So this might just be an external appearance for us. Don't pay attention to this paragraph as being logical. It's more about a phenomenology of this cognition. We have before us the alternating determination of the finite in the infinite. The finite is finite only with reference to the ought or the infinite, and the infinite is only infinite with reference to the finite. The two are inseparable and at the same time absolutely other with respect to each other. Each has in it the other of itself. Each is thus the unity of itself and its other, and in its determinateness not to be what itself and what its other is. It is existence. This alternating determination of self-negating and of negating the negating is what passes as the progress to infinity, which is accepted in so many shapes and applications as an unsurpassable ultimate at which thought, having reached this and so on to infinity, has usually achieved its end. This progress breaks out wherever relative determinations are pressed to the point of opposition, so that, though in inseparable unity, each is nevertheless attributed an independent existence over against the other. This progress is therefore the contradiction which is not resolved, but is rather always pronounced simply as present. So, this is the infinite progression, which was a major issue at the time. It was, the infinite striving that appears mostly in Fichte, famously, as far as I'm aware. But it's also an issue that is imminent in Kantianism. It's imminent in prior philosophies in which, the infinite can never be, and the finite can never be. What is the finite. The infinite can never appear in the finite. the finite cannot itself rise to the infinite. So we as human beings, sinful fallen beings, we can never, achieve divine perfection. We can only asymptotically approach it, but there is no end to that process. What we have before us is an abstract transcending which remains incomplete because the transcending itself has not been transcended. Before us we have the infinite, of course. This infinite is transcended, for another limit is posited, but just because of that only a return an instance made back to the finite. This bad infinite is in itself the same as the perpetual ought. It is indeed the negation of the finite, but in truth it is unable to free itself from it. The finite constantly resurfaces in it as its other, since this infinite only is with reference to the finite which is its other. The progress to infinity is therefore only repetitious monotony, the one and the same tedious alternation of this finite and infinite, also called the spurious infinite. So here we have now the finite going towards the infinite. The finite in being finite is not the infinite and therefore is limited. In self-limitation, it goes over to the infinite. The infinite says it is without limitation, therefore it is limited by not being limited, or is limited by limited it is limited by limited limiting, because the limitations works both ways. You can't have one without affecting the other. You cannot touch someone without at the same time being touched in touching someone. That's how the infinite's finitude works. And so we have this spurious cycle. This cycle is, one finite to another finite to another finite to another finite, endlessly. There are some Hegelians who use the language that the infinite is the self-transcendence of the finite. This is not true, because this process here, Hegel is telling us right here, is not what the infinite is. The infinite is not this endless cycle of transcending. He says we must transcend the transcending. The infinity of the infinite progress remains burdened by the finite as such, is thereby restricted, and is itself finite. In fact, however, it is thereby posited as the unity of the finite in the infinite. Only this unity is not reflected upon. Yet it alone rouses the infinite, or it alone rouses the finite in the infinite, and the infinite in the finite. It is, so to speak, the impulsive driving the infinite progress. This progress is the outside of this unity at which representation remains fixated. Fixated at that perennial repetition of one and the same alternation, at the empty unrest of a progression across the limit towards the infinite, which, in this infinity, finds a new limit, but is just as unable to halt at it as it is at the infinite. This infinite has the rigid determination of a beyond that cannot be attained for the very reason that it ought not be attained, since the determinateness of the beyond of an existent negation has not been let go. In this determination, the infinite has the finite as this side over against it, a side that is likewise unable to raise itself up to the infinite just because it has the determination of an other, that is, of an existence that perennially regenerates itself in that beyond precisely by being different from it. See affirmative infinity. In this reciprocal determination of the finite and the infinite alternating back and forth, as just indicated, the truth of these two was already implicitly present in itself, and all that is needed is to take up what is there. Just a reminder about the method. We have achieved our dialectic. What do you do to move on from the dialectic? We've certainly thought about it. It should be clear, hopefully, to you. I don't know if you agree that indeed we have this cycle of the finite, infinite, infinite, finite. That the infinite is finitized and the finite is infinitized. This is a contradiction to the understanding. This should be a contradiction to you. It should nonetheless make sense. It does make sense. It is intelligible. And we have a complete cycle of intelligibility. Now all there is to take up what there is. And that's literally what sublation and speculation, or rather sublation is a certain term for speculation, does. We take now what this total circle is. What this total circle of transcending is what the infinite will be, or the true infinite is. This back and forth movement constitutes the external realization of the concept, in which the content of the latter is posited, but externally, as falling out of the two. All that is needed is the comparing of these two different moments, in which the unity is given, which the concept itself gives, unity of the finite in the infinite. As has often been already noted, but must especially be kept in mind at this juncture, is the uneven expression for the unity as it is in truth, but also the removal of this uneven determination must be found in the externalization of the concept that lies ahead of us. Taken in their first, only immediate determination, the finite is the transcending of the finite. According to its determination, it is the negation of the finite. The finite, for its part, is only that which must be transcended, the negation in it of itself, and this is the infinite. In each, therefore, there is the determinateness of the other, whereas according to the viewpoint of the infinite progression, the two should be mutually excluded, and would have to follow one another only alternately. Neither can be posited and grasped without the other, the infinite without the finite without the infinite. Alright, let me reread that real quick just to make it clear. So, taken in their first, reading from the top, taken in their first only immediate determination, the infinite is the transcending of the finite, according to its determination. It is the negation of the finite. The finite, for its part, is only that which must be transcended, the negation in it of itself, and this is the infinite. In each, therefore, there is the determinateness of the other, whereas according to the viewpoint of the infinite progression, okay, so this is important. In each, therefore, there is the determinateness of the other. The infinite isn't indeterminate, and the finite also is clearly determinate. So, not only do they have determinants in each other, but they have the determinants of each other. That the finite is finite insofar as it is not infinite, and the infinite is infinite insofar as it is not finite. So the determinants of each other is internal to each other. They contain a negative reference to each other. In saying what the infinite is, namely the negation of the finite itself is said also. It cannot be avoided in the determination of the infinite. One need only know what is being said in order to find the determination of the finite in the infinite. Regarding the finite, it is rarely conceded that it is the null. This very nothingness is, however, the infinite from which it is inseparable. Understood in this way, they may seem to be taken according to the way each refers to its other. Taken without this connecting reference, and thus joined only through an and, they subsist independently, each only in existent over against the other. We have to examine how they would be constituted in this way. The infinite, thus positioned, is one of the two, but as only one of them, it is itself finite. It is not the whole, but only one side. It has its limit in that which stands over against it, and so it is the finite infinite. We have before us only two finites. The finitude of the infinite, and therefore its unity with the finite, lies in the very fact that it is separated from the finite and placed consequently on one side. The finite, for its part, removed from the infinite and positioned for itself, is this self-reference in which the relativity, its dependence and transitoriness are removed. It is the same self-subsistence and self-affirmation which the infinite is presumed to be. So let me read that. we have before us only two finites, the finitude of the infinite, and therefore its unity with the finite lies in the very fact that it is separated from the finite and placed consequently on one side. So, right, the infinite is related, finitized, determinate. The finite, for its part, removed from the infinite and positioned for itself, is a self-reference. And yet again, right, the importance of this self-reference. What happens when the finite is related to the infinite on the same level as determinate? The finite becomes, well, the infinite becomes finite. Then the finite, in referring to the infinite, refers not to the infinite as such, but really refers to the finite itself. So, its relationship as finite against the infinite on a determinate level is really the reference of the finite to the finite, in which relativity, its dependence and transitorieness are removed. It is the same self-subsistence and self-affirmation which the infinite is presumed to be. Negation of negation. The two pathways of consideration, even though they seem at first to have each a different determinateness for their point of departure, the former inasmuch as it assumes it to be only the reference of infinite and finite to each other, of each to the other, and the latter their complete separation from each other, yield one and the same result. The infinite and the finite, taken together as referring to each other in a connection which is presumed external, but is in fact essential to them, for without it neither is what it is. Each contains its other in its own determination, just as when each is taken for itself, when looked at on its terms, each has the other present in it as its own moment. So, this is Hegel pointing out that even if you don't do this dialectic properly, you still have the right content in it, if you just think about it. Even if you think the finite in the infinite external, you're going to find the finite in the infinite, and you're going to find the infinite in the finite. Because the infinite in being in the and relationship against the finite is itself finitized, and the finite in referring to itself as an absolute without referring to the infinite is infinite. This yields then the scandalous unity of the finite in the infinite, the unity which is itself the infinite that embraces both itself and the finite. The infinite, therefore, understood in a sense other than when the finite is separated from it and placed on the other side from it. Since they must now also be distinguished, each is within it, as just shown, itself the unity of both. There are thus two such unities. The common element, the unity of both determinacies, as such a unity posits them at first as negated, for each is to be what it is, being and being distinguished. In their unity, therefore, they lose their qualitative nature. An important reflection for countering the incorrigible habit of representing the infinite and the finite in their unity as still holding on to the quality that they would have when taken apart from each other, of seeing in that unity, therefore, nothing except contradiction, and not also the resolution of the contradiction by the negation of the qualitative determinateness of each. And so is the unity of the infinite and the finite, at first simple and universal, falsified. But further, since the two are now to be taken also as distinguished, the unity of the infinite, which is itself both of these moments, is determined differently in each. The infinite, therefore, as such, has in it the finitude which is distinction from it. In this unity, the infinite is the in itself, while the finite is only determinateness, the limit in the infinite. But such a limit is the absolute other of the infinite, its opposite. The infinite determination, which is the in itself as such, is corrupted by being saddled with a quality of this sort. The infinite is thus a finitized infinite. Likewise, since the finite is as such only the non in itself, but equally has its opposition in it by virtue of the said unity, is elevated above its worth, and so to speak, infinitely elevated. It is posited as the infinitized finite. Likewise, just as the simple unity of infinite and finite was falsified before by the understanding, so too is the double unity. Here also this happens because the infinite is taken in one of the two unities, not as negated, but rather as the in itself, in which, therefore, determinateness and restriction should not be posited, for they would debase and corrupt it. Conversely, the finite is equally held fixed, as not negated, although null in itself, so that in combination with the infinite it is elevated to what it is not, and is thereby infinitized, notwithstanding its determination that has not vanished, but is rather perpetuated. This is just going over what we've already gone over. The falsification that the understanding perpetrates with respect to the finite in the infinite, and holding the reciprocal reference fixed as qualitative differentiation, of maintaining that their determination is separate, indeed absolutely separate, comes from forgetting what for the understanding itself is the concept of these moments. According to this concept, the unity of the finite and the infinite is not an external bringing together of them, nor an incongruous combination that goes against their nature, one in which inherently separate and opposed terms that exist independently and are consequently incompatible would be knotted together. Rather, each is itself this unity, and this only as a sublating of itself, in which neither would have an advantage over the other in itselfness and affirmative existence, as has earlier been shown. Finitude is only a transcending of itself. It is therefore within it that the infinite, the other of itself, is contained. Similarly, the infinite is only as the transcending of the finite. It therefore contains its other essentially, and it is thus within it that it is the other of itself. The finite is not sublated by the infinite as by a power present outside it. It is infinity. Its infinity consists rather in sublating itself. Alright, and so yet another moment of, in addition to the definition that is ever growing of what sublation and absoluteness is. Infinity is self-sublation, absoluteness is self-sublation. Ultimately, the highest truth will be a self-sublated truth. Highest existence or being, whatever you want to call it, will itself be a self-sublating entity. This sublating is not consequently alteration or otherness in general, not the sublating of something. That into which the finite is sublated is the infinite as a negating of finitude, but the latter has long since been only existence, determined as a non-being. It is only the negation, therefore, that in the negation sublates itself. Thus infinity is determined on its side as the negative of the finite, and thereby of the determinateness in general, as an empty beyond. Its sublating of itself into the finite is the return from an empty flight, negation of the beyond, which is inherently a negative. Present in both, therefore, is the same negation of negation, but this negation of negation is in itself self-reference, affirmation, but as turning back to itself, that is, through the mediation that the negation of negation is. These are the determinations that it is essential to bring to view. The second point, however, is that in the infinite progression they are also posited, and how they are posited therein, namely, not in their ultimate truth. So also, negation is a mediation. Negation mediates itself, negates itself. Probably a good set of diagrams will help you. This whole section, you should mark down probably this section of about 5 paragraphs, because it is a form of the method being explained to you, being described in what we have already done. But instead of talking about like concept and subjectivity and truth and the idea quite yet, it's being stated in the terms of determinacy, of finitude, of sublation, of infinity. But if you've worked these out along the way, this should be perfectly clear to you what is happening and why. So, let me go back to the text here. So, he states something that, for example, that the finite is particularly precisely that which, self-sublates, self-references. The finite is finitized, and this has been the case for everything we've done so far. We started with being, insofar as being, is being. Insofar as being is, finitizes itself, it's nothing. It self-sublates. Insofar as, nothing, nothings, it is nothing. So, it self-sublates again. It comes back to its opposite, switches itself. If this hasn't become clear to you, it should be reiterated. People talk about this, and I see this even from people who, claim to be studying Hegel for quite a bit, even in graduate school. And people talk about sublation as if sublation is something that happens according or under something else. They say becoming sublates being and nothing. There's a truth to that, but that's not entirely true. The more proper truth is that being sublates itself into nothing, nothing sublates itself into being and nothing then together sublate themselves at that whole process as becoming. Everything is a self-sublation. There is no proper sense in which sublation is this thing that is effected upon the elements by a separate third. To repeat, becoming does not sublate being and nothing as if it is a third against them. Rather, it is their self-sublation which is becoming. Likewise, the finite sublates itself into infinity, by positing its own limits, by transcending them. This transcending then itself is the infinite. But then this transcending itself is opposed to the not transcending, to the moment of non-transcending, or the ought, or rather the restriction opposed to the ought. This itself then finitizes infinity. And then we have that whole cycle again. But if we grasp that cycle, the infinite is the self-transcending of the self-transcending. Finitude is, in its determination, its self-transcending. So to transcend the transcending is to transcend finitude. The transcending of the transcending is to no longer transcend, to let the transcending be. So, once the transcending transcends and it remains transcendent, only then is it truly infinite, and it no longer falls back into a transcending finite, but now is a stable infinity. Another way to see it is, we had being, nothing, processes in becoming. What becoming is the infinite form of this finite transcending, or rather becoming is as the infinite to the finitude of being and nothing. And if you got being and nothing, this should be pretty clear now. Dark Master asks, could this be part of why there are problems understanding this through formalization? Do you mean that the issue of self-sublation that I'm talking about?
Yeah, presenting sublation as this formal third.
There's no way to really make this work in any formal way, because it's a self-operation, and the only way to do self-operations is you have to actually do them. You cannot use the mechanism of a formalism to get the proper results out of that, because you have to operate the content.
It kind of strikes me like delegating this work to something else when people formalize it.
Yeah, and Snow asking, sublation transpires as an immediacy, right? Infinitely like flashing in and out or back and forth from nothing to being of determinate parts. There isn't really there's no distinction between pure being and a being. Pure being is just this the immediate abstraction of it, but being always means just immediacy, and immediacy is particularly the determinacy of what pure being is. And you say sublation happens as that immediacy. Yes, if you see this total process, right, of being and nothing, becoming just is that total process. there's nothing else to be said about it. There's no hidden third in that mode. Well, actually, there is a hidden third always, up until the very end. But that the reason there's a hidden third is because obviously there's going to be more that makes, whatever point that we're at before the idea, a finite mode. So, becoming isn't the true infinite itself. It's only a sub-infinite. It's a finitized infinite, because then itself, it has coming to be and ceasing to be. And then, we have that turn to existence. And then existence itself is a sub-infinite, which then, once we take it for what it is, it's immediately finitized. It becomes, determinacy, becomes reality negation, which then is another sub-infinite in the something and other, which then are finitized yet again as something and other, which then becomes sub-infinites of being for other and being in itself, which then, are finitized in that relationship again, which becomes sub-infinites of determination, which is finitized again with constitution, which becomes sub-infinite to the limitation, which then it becomes finitized as finitude finally, as such, in restriction and the ought, which becomes a sub-infinite as the finite as such in the self-transcending infinite, which then finally brings us to the true infinite, which is no longer operating in a transcending. And yes, they're not separate. There is no separation here. Yes, here's something what I want to talk about, which is unity and distinction, right? So what is the unity ultimately here, right? What is the unity between the infinite or the finite and the infinite? This whole white area. This is the science of logic, therefore it's the science of thinking. The real elements here, the real nature we're dealing with is pure cognition, pure thoughts. So, even so far as we think the finite, we do think it's self-transcendence. This is obviously what then the infinite is. The infinite then becomes this negative unity of the finite to the finite. The infinite posits itself as the non-finite. And insofar as it is the non-finite, obviously then we're placed in that relationship of, the back and forth. This back and forth is the true unity and the true identity of these things. The finite and the infinite are identical, are one, precisely as this total process. Because this isn't two processes. Pay attention to it. These aren't two thoughts you're thinking. This is one single thought process, and this is why these things can be sublated as one single infinite thought. Because they are. The reason you get into a thought loop, because that is the nature of what a true thought is. A true thought is an infinite, self-referring thought process, in this case, considering thought itself. It is only in this moment, these momentary switches, that it seems that you have two things. And you do have two things, because these are two opposite sides of determination or determinacies. But that's just in the finite mode. When you have the final circuit completed, this is revealed to be one single process. And the process cannot work without distinctions. You need the distinctions. There's no way to not have them.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
The appearances, these appearances of separation, are really so as appearances. The separations are appearances then, not like the actual thing itself is separate.
No, they're real, because if they weren't real, you couldn't even have this process. You need the finite. You need its distinction from the finite infinite. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to think at all, right? There would be no thought happening here. Thought is this constant switch of opposite determinations. Intelligibility needs these oppositions, these distinctions. The distinctions have to be real. They are appearances, but the appearances are essential. And what is essential to essence is that it appear. So we have the whole circuit is the true thought. The reason it is one is because we can actually do it as one single thought circuit.
I mean, when I think about the appearances for these things, I think about in the movement of the parts of this circuit, right? There appears to be distinctions in that process. That's what I'm thinking of as appearances. I don't know if
you're sure in that sense. These are appearances, but later on in the logic of essence, you find out that there is no distinction that really makes sense between essences and appearances, because what is essential to essences is appearances, and what makes appearances, when an appearance is total, when an appearance is absolute, it is the essence. So, what appears in appearance is essence. What is essential to essence is appearance.
Okay.
As a matter of fact, essence can only appear as essence because there is the distinction of the appearances to the essence. So essence itself is an appearance of appearances, just as appearances are what is essential to essence.
Maybe it kind of begs the question, how could you even tell that there is an essence any other way?
Well, Hegel will say that there is no other way to make essences a concept at all. We wouldn't be able to think essences if we didn't have this distinction to begin with. Where was I going with this? Oh, okay. So anyways, right. So we have basically an infinite circuit that happens with the thoughts. Being, nothing, or something other, or determination, constitution, limits, something, finite, infinite. Why is beyond just noticing the self-reference, right? The finite is finitized, then it must pass away as finite. We move over into the beyond of the finite is the infinite. Okay, beyond that linguistic sense, if you notice the entire process that's going on, it's one thought process, as I said. So what is there to sublate other than the same thing that sublates itself? When you understand that this is all one thought process, one thought, essentially, then it should make sense to you in that way that everything is a self-sublation. There is nothing to sublate something else. The only way sublation could possibly function is a self-sublation at all points. It might appear as an other sublation, but it's always essentially self-sublation. Give me a second. Okay, sorry about that. So is that making sense? Or am I confusing things more?
I feel like it makes sense, but I need to think about it more to better internalize it.
Yes, well, so, also in just the relationship of the finite, right? We go from the infinite. The infinite is supposed to be this thing that's not related to the determinate. The infinite is. Now, we already have done the is. Insofar as it is, there a distinction immediately arises that it is nothing. But insofar as that nothingness, well, is nothing and nothings, it is. This distinction necessarily arises for us. We don't usually think about it as becoming. Usually what happens there is we immediately jump to determinacy. Right, we have use that. So we jump to determinacy or existence. We have being and nothing. And look at that. We therefore have being with a non-being. This is not this, and this is not that. Therefore, these are both determinacies. Insofar as they are determinacies, this is real, this is negative. But then for itself, it is real, and then relatively, this is negative. But since they are both totalities of this, look at that. Then they are each something. But insofar as this is real, it's not this. But insofar as this is taken as the non-being of that, this is really the other. But then, this is also the other in the same way. And so this is other to the other. And insofar as, insofar as not this, it is a self-reference of the other. It is the other of the other, therefore it is something. So we have that relationship arise. And insofar as is the other of the other, and it is something, it is being for itself, insofar as it is not being for other. And we have that relationship. And then we have the determination, which then turns into this relationship of what is in the something is it's not being the other. It's being for other is what's in the something. That is what determination is. And likewise, constitution is this difference of the being for other and the being in itself, or the being for other of the being itself. And this, right, is constitution. And then these together come together as the boundary which distinguishes and unites them, that limit. But then that limit, in being, what it is intelligibly a unity, which is distinct from the something and the other, which is also we already know the other is already a something. And so each is an other to this otherness, but it's internal to them. This boundary is just what, if you didn't have it, you wouldn't have anything at all. So you couldn't have the something without it. It's internal to the something. It is the very constitution and determination of the something. If you get rid of it, the something disappears. So, something must be limited. But then that puts you in the situation of the finite and the infinite. And then the true infinite must be this entire relationship. And my point there is that even if we started with the immediacy of just, and we say, okay, we're starting with the absolute is everything, it's indeterminate, immediately we are dropped from the very beginning to the finite. We can't get rid of it. In the infinite, the finite inheres necessarily. There is no way around it. You must do it, because if you didn't do it, you just simply wouldn't even be. You wouldn't cognize at all. There is no such thing as an infinite cognition which is not finite, because in order to cognize the infinite plenum, if you want to call it that, you have to have that standpoint. You must have a standpoint of opposition. You must have a standpoint of finitude. The finite must be infinite, and only the infinite can rise to the finite. And to be finite, to be finitized, is to make that movement back to the true infinite, the true unbounded. The unbounded, which is not unbounded because it has no distinctions, but it's unbounded because it has no external distinctions. It has distinctions, but the distinctions are internal to it. So, the infinite has the finite within it. And it is the very definition of this movement and relationship of the finite. Outside of, all this white space, it doesn't exist. There is no such thing. It is the infinite is the very boundary of being, of meaning, of existence. Does that make sense? Yes, no. Did I confuse more?
I think so.
All right, well, consider it. Let's keep going so we can actually finish this. Sublating is non-being, present both mediation. So first, both are negated in that progression. The infinite as well as the finite, both are equally transcended. Second, they are also posited as distinct, one after the other, each positive for itself. We sort out these determinations while comparing them. Just as in the comparison, in the external comparing, we have separated the two ways of considering them, the finite and the infinite as referring to one another, and each taken for itself. The infinite progression, however, says more than this. Also posited in it, though at first still only in transition alteration, is the connectedness of the terms being distinguished. We now only need to see in one simple reflection what is in fact present in it. In the first place, the negation of the finite in the infinite, which is posited in the infinite progression, can be taken as simple and hence as mutual externality, only following of one upon the other. Starting from the finite, the limit is thus transcendent, the finite negated. We now have it's beyond the infinite, but in this, the limit rises up again. So we have the transcending of the infinite. This twofold sublation is nonetheless partly only an external event and an alternating of moments in general, and partly still not posited as one unity. Each of these moves beyond is an independent starting point, a fresh act, so that the two fall apart. But in addition, their connection is also present in the infinite progression. The finite comes first, then there is the transcending of it, and this negative or this beyond the finite is the infinite. Third, this negation is transcended in turn, a new limit comes up, a finite again. This is the complete self-closing movement that has arrived at that which made the beginning. What emerges is the same as that from which the departure was made. That is, the finite is restored. The latter has therefore rejoined itself in its beyond and has only found itself. Oh, that is some critical Hegelian language right there. Look at that. The finite has gone beyond itself. The latter has therefore rejoined itself in its beyond, has only found itself again. So not only does the finite do this, but the infinite does this as well. The infinite, in letting itself go into the finite, returns back to itself. The finite, in letting itself go into the infinite, returns back into itself. In letting itself be negated, only then can it finally be affirmed. Only then can it be. The same is the case regarding the infinite. In the infinite, in the beyond of the limit, only a new limit arises which has the same fate, namely that as finite it must be negated. Thus what is again at hand is the same infinite that just now disappeared in the new limit. By being sublated, by traversing the new limit, the infinite has not therefore advanced one jot further. It has distanced itself neither from the finite, for the finite is just this, to pass over into the infinite, nor from itself, for it has arrived at itself. Thus the finite and the infinite are both this movement of each returning to itself through its negation. They are only as implicit mediation, and the affirmative of each contains the negative of each, and is the negation of the negation. They are thus a result, and as such, not in the determination that they had at the beginning. Neither is the finite an existence on its side, nor the infinite an existence or a being in itself beyond that existence. That is, beyond existence is the determination of finitude. The understanding strongly resists the unity of the finite and the infinite only because it presupposes restriction and finitude to remain, like being in itself, constant. It thereby overlooks the negation of both, which is in the fact present in the infinite progression, just as it equally overlooks that the two occur in this progression only as moments of a whole, that each emerges only through the mediation of its opposite, but essentially equally by means of the sublation of its opposite. If this imminent turning back has for the moment been reckoned to be just as much the turning back of the finite to itself and of the infinite to itself, noticeable in this very result is an error connected with the one-sidedness just criticized. The finite and then the infinite is each taken as the starting point, and only in this way two results ensue. But it is a matter of total indifference which is taken as the starting point, and with this distinction caused by the duality of results dissolves itself. Says, but it is a matter of total indifference which is the starting point. You know, I said this when we first started this reading, that people will tell you, oh, you have to begin a certain place with Hegel and you have to go in a certain order. Once you get the method, if you do the method right, it doesn't matter where the hell you begin. You can start anywhere with anything. Because what matters is that you follow the strictness of the absoluteness of this method to just think the content that there is. There is no worry about making mistakes or being wrong. If you do it right, you cannot be wrong. Now, you may be doing this with something that somebody thinks is uninteresting, but you will not arrive at any falsehoods by either going forwards or backwards or beginning in the middle or the supposed end. There is no privileged standpoint. All you need to do is take a standpoint. Yeah, you know, there is no starting point. It's just wherever you start. And with this distinction caused by the duality of results dissolves of itself. And you know, when you have this full circuit, the duality as duality disappears because you recognize it's a unity of one process. This is likewise posited in the line of the infinite progression, open-ended on both sides, wherein each of the moments recurs in equal alternation, and it is totally extraneous at which position the progression is arrested and taken as beginning. The moments are distinguished in the progression, but each is equally only a moment of the other. Since both the finite and the infinite are themselves moments of the progress, they are jointly the finite, and since they are equally jointly negated in it and in the result, this result as the negation of their joint finitude is called, with truth, the infinite. I mean, it's like language, people, language, joints. You know, it's that middle point of the infinite circuit, that joint from which things are united and distinguished. The very thing which unites them is the very thing which divides them, and vice versa. You know, it's a negative unity. Negative unity is key to all this, and negative unity is just the meaning of that which we recognize if we think properly. You know, insofar as being and nothing are one and the same, to that extent they are different. Why? Because the very shifting point which collapses them is the very thing which also distinguishes them. Double meaning. Their distinction is thus the double meaning which they both have. The finite has the double meaning, first of being the finite over against the infinite, which stands over against it, and second, of being at the same time the finite and the infinite over against the infinite. Also, the infinite has the double meaning of being one of the two moments, it is then the bad infinite, and of being the infinite, in which the two moments, itself and its other, are only moments. Therefore, as in fact we now have it, the nature of the infinite is that it is the process in which it lowers itself to be only one of its determinations over against the finite, and therefore itself only one of the finites, and elevates its distinction of itself and itself to be self-affirmation, and through this negation, the true infinite. Here's the meaning of, the finite can only be, or the finite can only be finite insofar as it has an infinite nature. The infinite can only be infinite insofar as it also has a finite nature. Only a finite being could see and comprehend the infinite. Only insofar as you are an immediate individuality in the world can you come to rise to a true universality. There is no such thing as, some people want to think of some kind of like beings that don't have a finite perspective, that don't have self-interest, that don't have all these other things. And those are the truly great beings, or truly divine beings, spiritual beings, aliens, whatever you call them, you want to imagine. All those people have a completely erroneous understanding of what a true infinity is. God could only exist as beings like us, as beings which originate in a flawed, immediate distinction which finitizes them, but with the capacity of a truly finitized finitude, in which clearly within consciousness, the finitude of nature is itself finitized. All of nature falls into the domain of conscious apperception. Not only that, further, all the domain of conscious apperception then falls into the domain of thought. And thought is the one thing which falls within itself completely and existently as itself. So, when we began with being, we began with just a brute immediate. From that, we are forced to shift into a circle in which we have now come, at least at the point of the infinite, at one totality, which now reflects back into itself, just like self-consciousness does. This determination of the true infinite cannot be captured in the already criticized formula of a unity of the finite in the infinite. Unity is abstract, motionless, self-sameness, and the moments are likewise unmoved beings. But like both moments, the infinite is rather essentially only as becoming, though a becoming now further determined in its moments. Becoming has for its determinations first abstract being and nothing as alteration. It has existence, something, and other. Now, as infinite, it has finite and infinite, these two themselves as in becoming. So, the eternal can only be temporal. There is no such thing as an eternal being outside of time, for example. No, the eternal is the most radically temporal. It is the point of the present. It's in the point of the present in which both past and future are contained as totalities. This infinite, as being turned back onto itself, as reference of itself to itself, is being, but not indeterminate abstract being, for it is posited as negating the negation. Consequently, it is also existence, or there-ness, for it contains negation in general, and consequently determinateness. It is, and is there, present before us. Only the bad infinite is the beyond, since it is only the negation of the finite posited as real, and as such it is abstract first negation. Thus determined only as negative, it does not have the affirmation of existence in it. Held fast only as something negative, it ought not to be there. It ought to be unattainable. However, to be thus unattainable is not its grandeur, but rather its defect, which is at bottom the result of holding fast to the finite as such, as existent. It is the untrue which is the unattainable. And what must be recognized is that such an infinite is the untrue. Oh, that's a great line right there. It is the untrue which is unattainable. And the untrue is the finite. The negative finite, or the absolute finite. The image of the progression in infinity is the straight line. The infinite is only at the two limits of this line. It always only is where the latter, which is existence, is not, but transcends itself in its non-existence, that is, in the indeterminate. As true infinite bent back upon itself, its image becomes the circle, the line that has reached itself, closed and wholly present, without beginning and end. That is an image for you. That is a dialectical image. I don't know if any of you know about Walter Benjamin talking about dialectical images. That is literally Hegel giving you a dialectical image in the circle. True infinity, thus taken in general as existence posited as affirmative in contrast to abstract negation, is reality in a higher sense than it was earlier as simply determined. It has now obtained a concrete content. It is not the finite which is the real, but rather the infinite. Thus reality is further determined as essence, concept, idea, and so forth. In connection with the more concrete, it is however superfluous to repeat such earlier and more abstract categories as reality, and to use them for determinations more concrete than they are by themselves. Such a repetition, as when it is said that essence or that concept is real, has its origin in the fact that to uneducated thought, the most abstract categories such as being, existence, reality, finitude are the most familiar. That just gives you a sense in which, like, I think I mentioned this when I talked about this in the first meeting. And people love to talk about Hegelianism with stuff like negation of negation, abstract, negative, concrete. That's stupid. It's like trying to talk about the entire logic with the being of 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 the being of being of being. You can do that. Why you would is beyond me, because those categories are really stupid. I mean, they're at the very beginning of the logic. They're the least meaningful of all categories. They're not the things that really relate to the concreteness of reality and lived life and even cognition. People want to talk about negation are stupid. It's a pointless thing. People want to talk about the contradictions of so and so and such and such are stupid, because those aren't really the proper concepts at which the concreteness of it is happening. They're abstractions, they're formalisms, they're what people use when they don't know what the fuck they're talking about. The more immediate occasion, however, for recalling here the categories of reality is that the negation against which reality is the affirmative is here the negation of negation, and consequently itself posited over against that reality which finite existence is. Negation is thus determined as ideality. The idealized is the finite as it is in the true infinite. As a determination, a content, a distinct but not a subsistent existent, a moment rather. So there you go. Here is the first definition of two definitions of idealism. This is the definition of finite idealism, the ideality of the finite. To be finite is to be ideal because you are a moment, a figment of something else. We treat thoughts in regular language as we say, oh, well, that's just a thought. I mean, that's just an ephemeral figment of your imagination or your mind. That same intent is also what's happening in this definition, that insofar as the finite is the self-transcending and it vanishes itself away just like becoming, it is ideal. It is a moment. Ideality has this more concrete signification which is not fully expressed through the negation of finite existence. As regards reality and ideality, the opposition of finite and infinite is, however, so grasped that the finite assumes the value of the real, whereas the infinite that of the idealized. In the same way, further on, also the concept is regarded as an idealization, that is, as a mere idealization in contrast to existence in general, which is regarded as the real. When contrasted in this way, it is of course of no use to have reserved for the set concrete determination of negation the distinctive expression of idealization. In that opposition of finite and infinite, we are back to the one-sidedness of the abstract negative characteristic of the bad infinite is still fixed in the affirmative existence of the finite. There you go. Here's the ultimate critique Hegel needs to give against all thinkers of otherness, all thinkers of difference, all thinkers of the real. How long is the rest of this? Okay, a bit long. It's 198, 125. Five pages. What remains is the remarks. The hard stuff is here done. Let me read the transition. Ideality can be called the quality of the infinite, but it is essentially the process of becoming, and hence a transition. Like the transition of becoming into existence, we must now explicate this transition, this imminent turning back as a sublating of finitude that is a finitude as such, and equally as the negative finitude that only stands opposite to it is only negative finitude, is self-reference being. Since there is negation in this being, the latter is existence. But further, since the negation is essentially negation of a negation, self-referring negation, it is existence that carries the name being for itself. So, to say this something like this, what happens here with the infinite is what happens when we get to something where the development was inward towards something rather than upwards towards the infinite. Here with the infinite, it doesn't make sense to consider the remaining developments as something that goes beyond the infinite in an upward constructive way, because then the infinite would be finitized. So rather now the infinite turns inward, and so and what we deal with in being for other is now an infinite quality, infinite determinations, rather than finite determinations, and that's what makes it very interesting. Yeah, like I said, the remainder is remarks. I have a commitment I need to get to, so I think you can read those on your own, and they should be pretty clear. If there are any questions the next time we meet, which is next Sunday, we will go over those remarks if people need to. Otherwise, we will just start straight on chapter 3.
I suppose you talked about the value of the first 3 chapters. I was wondering, because you said that those 3 chapters were essential to then, if I understand correctly, be applied to the rest of his work, and to things in general. What I'm wondering is could you explain why these chapters in particular are so valuable to give people the method?
Because it's a good practice of getting yourself into the full mode of understanding how to do it. It also gives you the first view of what a proper totality looks like. So here with the infinite, we already have a view of that. The proper totality would look like something that's not a finite. It would not be a finite opposition. Obviously, some say like Marxists deny that there could be something like the infinite. To them, everything's just a finite. In which case, one would say that the Marxists simply don't understand what is going on, or at least don't understand what the scope is supposed to be relevant to, because they're materialist, or at least, the bad ones are materialists in a very crude sense.
Yeah, the vulgar materialism.
Yeah.
But so we could say that the first 3 chapters situate our understanding, right?
Yeah, they situate you to get a full sense. You've gone from an absolute indeterminate immediacy to one of the first levels, or even with just chapter 2, you've gone to the first level of like concrete totality, where if you follow the development and you've done it, you should be able to look upon that and get a grasp of what's going on, because that's what happened with me. I'm not saying that I'm like everybody, and I'm not saying that I'm special either, but I did notice that at least in my readings, that's what happened, that when I worked through these 2 chapters, it gave me an understanding of the first forms of totality, and without really looking much further into it, whenever I encountered stuff that referenced concepts that had this structure, they really did have this structure. Like, it wasn't just an illusion. You look into it, and the cognition that's going on is not exactly because each concept had its own uniqueness, but the structure is at least there. So this allows you actually, ironically, a formal access to Hegel, which nothing else does. Because then you have the true form rather than a false form. With the infinite, you now have the first complete, concrete form of what the true form of cognition is like, what a true form of concept is like, that they would have this kind of self-referring structure, that they would be a self-transcending transcendence, etc., etc. Besides that, these concepts are highly ubiquitous in philosophy throughout history and in the present. So it gives you a massive amount of just determinative thinking power to analyze and think about and critique various standpoints which exist now. I mean, there are people who take, for example, this concept, just the end of chapter 2. Robert Wallace thinks that this is the most important concept in all of Hegel. I disagree, although I think it's definitely one of the most important concepts. But to say that isn't to say very much in abstraction. Unless you actually do the process, there's no way for you to ever really notice how special these things really are.
Yeah, I think I'm following.
So we will leave this here. So I'll end the recording here. For those of you who watch later on, hope you found this helpful. See you next time.